From desert tribes to world empire. The rise of Islam. Welcome to The Third Eye, the podcast where we dive deep into the forces that shaped our world. Today's episode asks a bold question. How did a small, seemingly unremarkable tribal movement from the Arabian deserts transform into an empire stretching from Spain to the borders of China in just 70 years? This isn't just a story of battles and wins. It's really about the massive shifts in society and politics during the big crises of the 6th and early 7th centuries. Let's begin. 536 AD, the volcano that cast a shadow over the world. In 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland sent ash flying, changing everything. Historical sources, including the Byzantine historian Procopius, describe a dim sun and atmospheric haze that lasted 18 months, plunging large parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia into prolonged gloom. This volcanic winter brought lower temperatures, crop failures, and widespread famine from Europe to China. Contemporary records describe unseasonable frosts and failed harvests. It was, according to some scholars, one of the most challenging climate events of the era. Economies based on subsistence agriculture collapsed, and political structures that depended on stable production and tax revenue began to strain under the pressure. The Justinian plague hits in 542 AD. Just a few years later, around 541 to 542 AD, the plague of Justinian hit. It was probably a bubonic plague that spread through the Eastern Roman Empire and beyond. Estimates suggest mortality rates in some regions were catastrophic, with cities like Constantinople losing perhaps up to half their population and the broader Mediterranean world suffering huge demographic shocks. This demographic collapse had three major effects. 1. Economic contraction. Agricultural labor vanished in many regions. 2. Empires faced tough times recruiting and keeping their armies strong. 3. Breakdown of trade networks, impacting long-distance commerce. 5. The ancient world had never faced such simultaneous climate, famine, and disease disasters. In 570 AD, Muhammad was born. Against this backdrop of crisis, Muhammad was born around 570 AD in Mecca, a trading city in the Arabian Peninsula. Arabia at this time was a patchwork of tribal societies. There was no centralized state, and its people were often described in classical sources as having limited literacy with religiously diverse pre-Islamic Arabian society, consisting primarily of polytheistic pagan tribes alongside established Jewish and Christian communities. But these communities were not static. They were deeply enmeshed in long-distance trade connecting Arabia with Africa, Persia, and the Byzantine world. Muhammad would grow up in this dynamic yet fragmented environment. 602 AD, the Roman-Persian World War. In 602 AD, a catastrophic war began between the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire and the Persian Sasanian Empire. This conflict, sometimes called the Last Great Roman-Persian War, would rage for 25 years. It was a total war that scarred the Old World. Both empires deployed massive armies across the Middle East from Anatolia to Persia. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Frontiers were devastated and depopulated. Commerce and social order in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine collapsed. Historians note that the war exhausted both powers militarily, economically, and demographically long before Islam's rise. This war also intensified religious and sectarian identities across the region. Many Christians were on the Byzantine side, but Jewish communities had a long-standing bond with Persia, dating back to Cyrus the Great, and willingly allied with them. Some internal tribal conflicts further destabilized the Arabian frontier during this period. 610 AD, Muhammad starts sharing his teachings. In 610 AD, in this era of climate devastation, pestilence, and imperial exhaustion, Muhammad began receiving and preaching his revelations. His message called for social justice, emphasized monotheism, claiming to be the last messenger of God, challenged entrenched tribal hierarchies, proposed a well-controlled social and religious framework. Muhammad's message really resonated with struggling communities in Arabia, but it came with a tough choice. Accept Islam or face brutal consequences. The Roman-Persian War wraps up in 627 AD. By 627 AD, the epic Roman-Persian conflict wrapped up with the Battle of Nineveh, where the Byzantines scored a major win. But although Byzantium emerged the technical victor, both empires were in ruins. Economies were depleted, armies had suffered huge casualties, tax revenues collapsed. Borders were porous and poorly defended. They were powerful only in name, vulnerable and exhausted in reality. This imperial fatigue was precisely the strategic opening the emerging Muslim community needed. 632 AD, Muhammad's death and Arab unification. In 632 AD, Muhammad passed away. But instead of falling apart, the Muslim community stayed strong under Caliph Abu Bakr. There was a brief internal conflict known as the Ridda Wars, in which tribes resisting Islam were brought back into the fold. Once completed, Arabia was unified in a way it had never been before. This unity mattered. For centuries, Arabia had been tribal and fractured. Now, a cohesive political and religious identity emerged, providing structure and mobilization capacity unmatched in its history. 633 AD. The Islamic expansion begins. By 633 unified, motivated, and strategically savvy, the early Muslim armies began campaigns beyond Arabia. They moved into the Levant, Persia, Egypt, and North Africa by the early 700s, even into Spain and up to the edges of Central Asia. How did this occur so rapidly? Key factors: imperial exhaustion. Both Byzantines and Sassanians were brittle from decades of war, demography, loss, and economic strain. Their frontier defenses were weak. Social and religious cohesion. Islam provided a unifying identity that bound disparate tribes into disciplined forces. Political vacuum and adaptability. Local populations, including some marginalized communities, sometimes saw Muslim rule as less oppressive or less extractive than the old empires. Arab armies excelled in military mobility, using fast, light cavalry and tribal networks to outsmart slower imperial forces, lured by promises of riches or the reward of 72 virgins in paradise for martyrdom. Conclusion: a convergence of crises and opportunity. 536 to 542. Climate collapse and pandemic weakened old world systems. 2. 602 to 627. A titanic imperial war bleeds Byzantium and Persia. 3. 610 to 632. A new religious and political movement unifies Arabia. 4. 633 onward. Seizing the moment, the Arab state expands across empires that can no longer effectively defend themselves. In just 70 years, a group once seen as outsiders became the builders of one of the biggest empires ever. That's not magic, that's history shaped by crisis, leadership, unity, and timing. Thanks for listening to The Third Eye. Join us next time as we explore another turning point in history and the lessons it holds for our world today.